That was all the time the Pentagon gave itself. Naval Support Activity Western Australia, a base that existed on planning documents as a late 2027 project, was declared operationally stood up at HMAS Stirling, Garden Island, on the morning of July 14, 2026. 6 days of compressed commissioning, 6 days of accelerated logistics, advanced team deployments, and security protocol activations that the U.S. Navy had clearly pre-staged well before the official clock started. 6 days. And in those same 6 days, a People's Liberation Army Navy Surface Action Group, 3 surface combatants operating under the declared mission of anti-piracy patrol, was rounding the southern coast of Java, transiting through the eastern approaches of the Sunda Strait, and tracking southwest into the Indian Ocean. The timing was not coincidence. On the radar scope screen, 2 tracks converge, one the patrol pattern, one the transit corridor. The editor does not need to explain what the picture already shows. Retention, checkpoint, 000, hook strike moment, 0 context. Retention, checkpoint, yes. Here is the paradox at the center of this story. The United States has had access to HMAS Stirling since the Cold War. It already rotates Virginia-class submarines through the Perth complex under AUKUS arrangements formalized in 2023. It already has Diego Garcia in the central Indian Ocean, a fortress of American logistics and strike capability sitting 2,200 miles northwest of Perth. So why compress a 2027 basing project into a single week in July 2026? Why now, and why in response to 3 Chinese surface ships running an anti-piracy patrol that Beijing conducts regularly, and that no analyst would call a crisis? The move does not add up, until you look at the map. The radar scope keeps sweeping. The contacts keep moving. If you want to stay with the picture rather than read the headline, subscribe. This channel follows the track all the way to the horizon. Retention, checkpoint. 4 Dialzial stakes, Ben Dialzial stakes. Mike Kivlenes. The plan has been building its Indian Ocean presence methodically for over a decade. The Djibouti base, opened in 2017, was the first permanent overseas military installation China had established since the Ming Dynasty. The strategic logic was readable in the basing decisions themselves, not the official statements. Djibouti sits at the mouth of the Red Sea, astride the Bab el-Mandeb, the choke point through which roughly 12% of global trade transits annually. A military logistics facility there gives the plan refueling, crew rotation, and signal intelligence capability at one of the world's most important maritime narrows. What Djibouti established was a template: identify a strategic node, negotiate access under a civilian or commercial cover story, port development, anti-piracy operations, humanitarian logistics, build dual-use infrastructure, then expand the military footprint once the legal and diplomatic framework is in place. The question the Pentagon has been asking for the last 3 years is where that playbook gets run next in the Indian Ocean basin. The candidate list is not long: Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, Pakistan's Gwadar, the Maldives where China has been deepening infrastructure investment, and most consequentially some form of access along the Indonesian archipelago, the 3,400-mile chain of islands that forms the northern wall of the Indian Ocean and contains 2 of the most strategically critical straits on the planet. Pull back to the open ocean horizon and trace the geometry. From the Perth complex, a Virginia-class submarine running northeast crosses roughly 750 nautical miles to reach the Sunda Strait, the shallow passage between Java and Sumatra visible on the sonar display as a compressed, cluttered contact environment. The Lombok Strait, the deeper water route between Bali and Lombok, sits closer at around 1,550 nautical miles, and on the sonar dome footage, the difference in water depth is audible before it is visible. Both passages are well within sustained patrol range, with margin left over. Both are also the corridors a Type 052D destroyer or a planned submarine would have to transit to move from the South China Sea into the open Indian Ocean, and on the international waters patrol footage, the choke point geometry explains itself. 1 base, 2 straits. That geometry is the whole argument for NSA Western Australia. But here is the part the map does not show yet: retention checkpoint. 5-min microfinal. HMAS Stirling alone was never sufficient for what AUKUS actually demands. The agreement signed in 2021 and progressively implemented through 2023 and 2024 envisions Australia operating nuclear-powered submarines, with Virginia-class boats rotating through Australian facilities during the transition period running through the early 2030s, before Australian-built SSNs begin commissioning under the SSN AUKUS design. Nuclear submarine operations require infrastructure that conventional naval facilities do not provide: sensitive material handling, dedicated secure berthing with the right dredging profiles and pier configurations, logistics chains for specialized components. And, critically, the administrative and security superstructure of a U.S. naval support activity, rather than simply a bilateral access arrangement hosted at an allied facility. HMAS Stirling provided the physical location. NSA Western Australia provides the institutional permanence. That distinction matters more than it might appear from the outside. The strange part about the compressed 6-day timeline is not that the Americans moved fast. The preparation clearly predated the activation by months. What the 6-day declaration represented was a choice to make the activation visible, to let the timing speak, rather than complete the stand-up quietly on a normal administrative schedule. Put yourself in the position of the Pelian Task Group commander rounding Java in those same 6 days. You are running what Beijing calls a routine anti-piracy patrol, the same framing China has used for its sustained naval presence in the Gulf of Aden since 2008. You are transiting toward the Indian Ocean with 3 warships. And on July 14, the United States publicly declares a new permanent naval installation in Western Australia that puts your entire transit route under a new threat envelope that did not exist as formal doctrine a week before. That is a signal. The question is what it signals. Retention, checkpoint. Most people assume the primary audience for a basing announcement like this is China. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The signal is more layered than that. The first audience is the Playbook itself, specifically its submarine force. China operates a growing fleet of Type 093 Shang-class and Type 095 attack submarines, with the 095 program representing a significant capability jump in quieting and sensor quality. For the PLN to project sustained undersea power into the Indian Ocean from its primary submarine bases at Yulin on Hainan Island, boats must transit one of the Indonesian straits. The Malacca Strait, at its narrowest approximately 1.7 miles wide at the Phillips Channel, is too shallow for submarines to transit submerged. The Sunda Strait runs roughly 15 miles wide at its narrowest navigable passage. The Lombok Strait, at approximately 25 miles at its narrowest deepwater channel, offers better transit geometry, and its depths accommodate submerged passage. A Virginia-class SSN operating from Perth, with the maintenance and logistics pipeline that NSA Western Australia formalizes, can conduct barrier patrol operations on both approaches simultaneously, in a sustained rotation. From the PANL's planning perspective, that means the gateway from the Pacific Submarine Force into the Indian Ocean now has a permanent American undersea threat on the far side. What strikes us here is the elegance of the geometry. The United States did not need to enter the South China Sea. It did not need to challenge the first island chain, where Chinese anti-access and area denial systems create genuine operational risk for American surface forces. Move the strategic contest to a different body of water entirely, one where the United States has had uncontested superiority for decades, and where geography and alliance structure strongly favor the American position. The second audience is Indonesia. Jakarta has pursued a carefully balanced foreign policy, maintaining economic engagement with China while hosting deepening security conversations with the United States. Indonesia controls both the Sunda and Lombok Straits under the legal framework of its archipelagic sea lanes. American recognition of Indonesian maritime sovereignty over those passages is embedded in freedom of navigation doctrine. A U.S. naval installation in Perth, publicly framed as AUKUS infrastructure, carries an implicit message to Jakarta. The American commitment to this region is institutional and permanent, not episodic. The third audience, and this is the one most analysis misses, is the Australian domestic political system. AUKUS remains contested in Australian public discourse. The cost of the submarine program, now estimated somewhere between 200 and 360 billion Australian dollars over its lifetime depending on the scope accounting methodology used, generates sustained political pressure. A formal U.S. naval support activity declaration, with the institutional weight that comes with it, makes the American end of the AUKUS commitment visible and concrete, in a way that diplomatic statements and rotational arrangements cannot. The Americans put a sign on the building. The board does not change when you build a base. It changes when the other side has to recalculate because of what the base enables. Here is the take that will probably draw some pushback. The 6-day timeline was deliberate theater, and it was the right call. The strategic logic of NSA Western Australia would have been identical if the Pentagon had completed the stand-up on a quiet Thursday with a brief press release. But the compressed public activation, timed against a visible PLAN transit, was a choice to communicate at operational tempo rather than at bureaucratic tempo. Some analysts will argue this kind of signaling risks unnecessary escalation. The counter-argument is that ambiguity about American commitment in this region has its own costs, and deliberate clarity does not. Retention. Checkpoint, 50% mid-roll hook TLA. So let us return to the central question. Why compress a 2027 project into 6 days in July 2026? The answer involves two timelines running in parallel. The first is the AUKUS submarine pipeline. Under the current implementation schedule, the United States is committed to delivering Virginia-class submarines to Australia through a series of arrangements that escalate in the early 2030s, with Australian SSNs beginning to commission around the mid-2030s. That pipeline requires infrastructure to be in place and proven before the boats arrive, not built in parallel with their delivery. The Navy needs NSA Western Australia operational well ahead of the peak rotational demand, which means the 2027 target date was already compressed relative to program needs. The second timeline is the PLAN's Indian Ocean Access Program. Open source reporting through 2025 and into 2026 has documented Chinese port investment and access negotiations with several Indian Ocean littoral states that the Pentagon reads as potential dual-use military access sites. The Djibouti Playbook leaves a recognizable footprint in the contract structures and infrastructure specifications involved. Pentagon planners watching those negotiations drew a straightforward conclusion. If the Americans wait until 2027 to formally establish permanent presence in Western Australia, while the plan is actively building out its Indian Ocean access network, the gap between the two postures widens during the most consequential period of the competition. We dug through the publicly available AUKUS implementation documents and the open-source reporting on Plan Indian Ocean activities, and one pattern kept surfacing in the analysis. The Americans have been consistently behind the plan's basing timeline in the Indian Ocean, and the 2027 NSA WA date reflected that lag. The 6-day activation in July 2026 was the Pentagon compressing that gap by 13 months. The obstacle was not operational. The obstacle was bureaucratic and diplomatic. NSA Western Australia required a status of forces agreement addendum, negotiating the specific legal protections for U.S. personnel at an installation formally hosted within the boundaries of an Australian base. That negotiation, which ran through late 2025 and the first quarter of 2026, was the actual constraint on the timeline. Once the legal framework was signed, the physical infrastructure was ready, having been pre-positioned over the preceding months. The 6-day stand-up was the back end of a much longer runway. Retention, checkpoint, 14-min microfinal payout. Now consider what planning staff in Beijing sees on their own sonar display: the same choke points, the same patrol corridors, the same compressed geometry between the submarine sonar dome footage and the strait approaches, with a Virginia-class boat now factored into the board. Before NSA Western Australia, the plan's Indian Ocean access equation looked like this: transit through one of the Indonesian straits, sustain operations in the Indian Ocean using a combination of underway replenishment and the Djibouti logistics node, and operate in a theater where American presence is real but where there is no permanent U.S. installation between Diego Garcia and the Philippines that can provide Virginia-class specific support for sustained submarine operations. After NSA Western Australia, the equation changes. A Virginia-class SSN on rotational deployment from Perth can conduct barrier operations at Lombok or Sunda for extended periods without returning to Diego Garcia, because the maintenance and logistics pipeline is now 1,550 nautical miles from the patrol area rather than 2,200. The planned surface action group that rounded Java in July 2026 was being watched by whatever U.S. or allied undersea assets were already in the region. Going forward, planners have to assume that any transit through either strait occurs within operational range of a U.S. SSN that can be supported continuously from Perth. The Virginia-class is not a vessel the plan currently has an answer for in terms of acoustic signature and sonar performance. That asymmetry is measurable and documented in the public record of comparative submarine assessments. The plan's Type 093 and even the projected 095 operate at noise levels that place them at a detection disadvantage against Virginia-class passive sonar systems in the operating environments relevant to the Indonesian strait approaches. The Perth basing complex does not change that physics, but it extends the duration and persistence of American undersea presence at the critical choke points. What do you think? Does permanent undersea presence at those straits actually deter Plan Indian Ocean operations, or does it push Chinese planners toward accelerating their own submarine basing program in ways that ultimately produce a less stable Indian Ocean? Drop that in the comments. On the angled flight deck, the last aircraft of the evening recovery catches the wire. The carrier settles into its patrol box. The watch changes. The ocean does not. The second-order consequences of NSA Western Australia run in several directions simultaneously. The first is pressure on Indonesia. Jakarta has been careful not to allow either the United States or China to use Indonesian maritime territory as a platform for their bilateral strategic competition. The Indonesian government's response to both AUKUS and the NSA activation has been measured, noting sovereignty concerns while not formally opposing the arrangements. But the presence of a permanent U.S. naval installation in Perth, with the operational patterns that accompany it, makes that neutrality harder to maintain over time. The Sunda and Lombok Straits are Indonesian territory. American submarines patrolling their approaches, Chinese surface groups transiting through them, both sides describing what they are doing as lawful navigation, while both sides are factually engaged in strategic competition. That geometry places Indonesia at the center of a contest it did not choose and cannot easily exit. The second consequence is the signal it sends to Japan and South Korea about the depth of the American commitment to the AUKUS framework, and by extension to the broader Indo-Pacific alliance architecture. If the United States is willing to accelerate a permanent installation by 13 months to respond to a routine PIAS transit, that communicates something about how seriously Washington is treating the regional competition. That communication has value independent of the specific military capability NSA Western Australia provides. The third consequence, and this one remains genuinely unresolved, is what the plan's response will be. Beijing has options. It can accelerate discussions with potential Indian Ocean access partners, the candidates mentioned earlier, in ways that establish logistics nodes capable of supporting Chinese submarine operations without requiring the transit through the Indonesian straits that NSA Western Australia now threatens. It can invest in extending the range and endurance of its submarine force to reduce dependence on the straits as the primary gateway. Or it can accept that the Indian Ocean will remain a theater of American structural advantage for the foreseeable future, and focus its competitive energy on the Western Pacific, where the anti-access and area denial architecture gives China stronger geometric position. One detail that keeps surfacing in the analysis: the PIN's most significant unresolved problem in the Indian Ocean is not American submarines. It is the absence of a permanent logistics node between Djibouti and the South China Sea that can support PIN submarine operations. Djibouti is configured for surface vessel support. A Chinese submarine base somewhere in the Indian Ocean littoral, whether in Pakistan, Myanmar, or elsewhere, would change the calculus more fundamentally than any additional surface ship deployment. The Americans appear to be betting that the Djibouti playbook cannot find a suitable location for submarine-capable infrastructure before NSA Western Australia reaches full operational capacity with AUKUS submarines rotating through it. That bet may be right, it may not be. On the Carrier Island superstructure, the running lights hold steady against the Pacific Ocean expanse. The submarine is already submerged, already on patrol, already inside the range ring. The board has changed, and the next move belongs to someone else. Here is the board as it reads today. The United States has a permanent naval installation in Western Australia that extends Virginia-class submarine operations across both Indonesian strait approaches. It has Diego Garcia in the central Indian Ocean. It has AUKUS committed to delivering Australian nuclear submarines in the 2030s. The PLN has Djibouti, a growing surface ship presence and an active program of port investment across the Indian Ocean littoral. The Americans hold the undersea advantage and the geographic position at the strait exits. The PLN holds the economic leverage and the timeline on new access negotiations. NSA Western Australia does not close the competition. It sets the terms for the next phase of it. The compressed 6-day stand-up sent a message about American institutional commitment that a 2027 administrative activation never could have sent. The PLN task group rounded Java, completed its transit, and moved into the Indian Ocean under the same flag it has always flown. But the map they now have to defend is different, and maps once changed do not change back on their own. Will the PON develop a submarine-capable Indian Ocean logistics node within the decade? Comment yes or no, because if they do, this whole geometry shifts again, and we will be back here reading a different board. The carrier sailed home, the base stayed open, the strait did not move.